I heard that our doorbell ring, and through the window I could see a senior district attorney along with two strangers standing outside. And so I let them in the house, and I knew something was very wrong at that point. One of the men said, "Judge, please sit down." He said Megan had been murdered earlier in the day. Parents' worst nightmare became a reality for me. The most devastating news you can ever hear.
Welcome to A Home That Heals. I'm Bree, along with my mom, Dee. And today on A Home That Heals, we speak with a judge and a dad who knows all too well the devastating power of today's drug culture.
Drugs like meth and now the flood of fentanyl coming into not just our country, but our neighborhoods. They're so addictive that we must prepare our kids.
Remember, you were made for this. And our guest today has a moving story to help you navigate this difficult issue in your home.
We're talking about kind of a heavy topic today, and it's this one that we raised a few weeks ago, Bree, when we said there's some things you just can't ignore, even though a lot of us want to just put blinders on and not really think about these issues. But I was reminded really very vividly of that the other day when I walked into your house, and you guys have that puzzle table. I love that. Always a puzzle going, and anybody can sit down and work on it as they go. Seems like that's a tradition that has stuck in your family.
It is. It started at Christmas time, but now we're sitting it out year round, and we love it. It is. It's a fun gathering place.
Right now you have a really cool puzzle on there too that just struck me as just idyllic. You know, it's this old-fashioned scene that is one that you just picture out of Andy Griffith.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and we love Andy Griffith. But it is. It's the old storefronts, kid riding his bike with his dog on his leash right next to him, old police car, and old, I think some other old cars and stuff like that. But it does. It takes you back to simpler days.
Well, when I saw that and I saw your husband working on it, I stopped and I just said, "Oh, I love that puzzle. Oh, don't you wish we could go back to those days?" And he said in such a heartfelt way, "Yeah, I really, really do." Mm-hmm. And I think that's how we all feel. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to think about how far our world has come or how far past those idyllic days are. But they are. And so we have to deal with this idea that we got to make our kids aware of what's going on and make them aware of the fact that drugs can be very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I think it's a concern parents everywhere are feeling, and they're wondering how to combat it, and they're wondering how to prepare their kids, just like you said, so that they are savvy, so they are smart, they're street smart. They understand how to handle this when it comes knocking at their doorstep instead of if it ever is something that they encounter.
And you can find out a lot about it. You know, right now, fentanyl is in the news quite a bit. And going back to my old news days, I just can't resist the opportunity to throw out a few facts and figures. I'll keep it really quick. But, fentanyl, which is becoming just a scourge on our country, it is so powerful. It is 100 times more potent than morphine. 100 times. I mean, a teeny tiny bit can kill a person. And so that's just one of the things that we frankly fear. I mean, we fear this stuff. It's out there. We talk about the marijuana that was, available back in the day, back when I was a teenager and early 20s, completely different than the marijuana that's available today. And that marijuana is oftentimes laced with fentanyl because fentanyl is so cheap and easy to make. You can put it in something like a joint and it's more powerful, but yet it's deadly. And the proof is in the pudding. We've had more than 107,000 people died of drug overdoses and drug poisonings last year in the U.S. And about 2/3 of those involved synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Okay, I'm done with my facts and figures, but let's talk real life now. We've got a really special person for you to hear from today.
Yeah, no one knows this reality of the drug threat better than our friend that you're about to hear from today. Judge Tom Kohl was a drug court judge in Oregon when his own daughter became an addict. She got caught up in the violence and the darkness of the Russian drug gang. And as you're about to hear, the judge's worst fears became his family's reality. Yet despite that, he shares his story with us of hope.
But it does begin in despair. And so we're going to pick up Judge Kohl's story as he shares with you a night that changed his life forever as his daughter's drug addiction and involvement in that Russian gang came to a climax with a terrible tragedy.
On July 21st of 2006, I got the worst news I could ever get. It was about 11 p.m., and I was in bed, and I heard our doorbell ring, and put on some sweats and went downstairs. And we had a window in the door. Through the window, I could see a senior district attorney along with two strangers standing outside. And so I went downstairs and let him in the house, and I knew something was very wrong at that point. One of the men said, "Judge, please sit down." And at that point, he told me that he said Megan had been murdered earlier in the day. And so, a parent's worst nightmare became a reality for me. The most devastating news you can ever hear.
And I imagine in the shock of that moment, what goes through every parent's mind, no matter what level of tragedy their child faces. And those are those questions. Why? Why did she not? Why wasn't she kept in jail? Why me? Why God?
Yeah. In a situation like that, I think people either turn to God or turn away from God. And I was so fortunate that I was able to turn to God. I mean, I dove into the Psalms, and every day I was in the Psalms. It was really amazing in that type of situation where Megan was murdered. I didn't know how she was murdered at that point in time. I learned 2 weeks later how she was murdered, and that was absolutely devastating.
The worst.
But it was really strange because I could sleep at night. I have no idea. I mean, Jesus just gave me that ability to go to sleep. I mean, in the morning I would wake up, and the first thing I would, I was so devastated. I mean, physically, emotionally, but Jesus got me through every day. I remember a few days after we had just moved into our new house. Then we had moved from the country into the city. And we were really blessed because it was a news story. It was a national news story, and the press had actually gone up to our old residence up on a mountain where we used to live. They didn't realize that we had moved down into the city, and so we didn't have that distraction. From that point on, I did not watch any local news until I moved here to Idaho. And that was like 16 years ago.
Wow.
Never watched local news because what I saw in local news was the stories about people getting hurt, murdered, and I didn't want to experience any of that. So
you really trauma.
Yes.
I mean, you had trauma. Those would be triggers for you to relive it all over again.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting to me now, Tom, Judge, is that you relive it by telling, like even today, I mean, I can see in your eyes the pain as you tell it again. It's different though. Because why?
Well, God has one of the most important verses for me is Romans 8:28, where God says, God through Paul says, all things work for the good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. And the idea of Romans 8:28, if somebody would have mentioned that to me 2 or 3 days after Megan had been murdered, I don't know what I would do. So if somebody
not a good idea.
Not a good idea.
Yeah.
So reciting scripture or referring to scripture when somebody is going through a difficult time in their life, you really need to be discerning on that. You have to, but now I understand what Romans 8:28 really means, and it says all things work for the good, which really means all things. It doesn't mean most things or some things. It means all things, even the brutal murder of a young 21-year-old daughter. God can take that and turn that into something good. He can turn ashes into beauty, tragedy into triumph. I mean, that's what God is in the business of doing, right? And so I was able to see that as the months and years went by, how God could just take that and do something good with it. And so I've had opportunities to speak with parents who have lost loved ones, in my courtroom where, somebody has been murdered, they were in a car accident. I've had all sorts of opportunities I could see in the courtroom, the parents, sometimes the bitterness and the sorrow and the anger they had at somebody who had harmed their child or taken the life of their child. And I would actually have the parents come back in my chamber with me after like a sentencing occurred, and I would be able to talk to them. And I specifically remember one occasion where I'd asked some parents to come back into my office, and they were there, and their daughter had been killed in a drunk driving accident, and I sat, they sat down, and I said, I want you to know, I think I kind of know what you're feeling. And they looked at me and they said, no, Judge, you don't have a clue what we're feeling. And I said, I do. I said, I lost it. Do you know my story? And they said, no. And I said, I lost a daughter through murder earlier. And I said, I kind of have a feeling what you're going through. And so I just wanted you to know that as time goes by, things are going to get a little bit better. I mean, there's always going to be a hole in your heart for the loss of the child, but things will get better. And so I've been able to pray with parents in my office, and
Wow.
and it's been a really remarkable journey, because one of my other favorite verses is 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 through 4, where it says we worship a God of all comfort who comforts us during our sorrows, so that we can comfort others with the same comfort we got from God. And so that's one of the reasons God allows those type of things to happen. So it's going to happen, and so I'm able to comfort other people.
There's more to this story of how God has used Megan's story in amazing ways. But, I just picture who's listening today, and we probably have some parents who are relating to you. They have faced some tragedy. They're in the middle of it, or maybe they're coming out of the shock of it and really wondering if God can do, like he says, if he really can turn it into something good, something that you can look back on and say, that's what this verse means. But what would you say to those parents that are listening and they're just plain old fearful? Because this drug problem that we are seeing in our country today, it's not getting better since Megan's involvement years ago. Now it's been 17, 18 years ago.
Yeah.
Meth came onto the scene. I mean, I remember back in my news days, I did work on a documentary and saw the faces of meth, saw what it does. It absolutely destroys people on all levels. It destroys their physical appearance. It destroys their ability to love their own kids. It's horrible, and it can. And I remember back then, the big thing we had was not even once. Don't try even once, because you can be addicted. Now with fentanyl pouring into the country, not even once, because fentanyl can kill you the first time you take it, or you're addicted, just beyond even anything we can imagine. So those parents that are fearful of that, as you look back on your own experience, what kind of advice do you have for parents that are listening to you today and saying, I've got to try to protect my kids?
Yeah. Well, the best advice is pray. pray.
Well, amen to that. Yeah.
Yeah, pray for your kids. And you really need to be aware of who they're hanging out with. It's one of those things. I remember one time I went over and picked up Megan after she spent a night at somebody's house. I didn't know where she was, but I knew where she was. Her mom told me, and so I went over and picked her up. She was probably 13 or 14 then. And I knocked on the door. It was a trailer, and knocked on the door, and this guy answered the door, and he had a wife beater T-shirt on, and he was overweight. And I looked inside, and there were beer cans all over the inside of the house, and I couldn't believe that my daughter had actually spent the night there. And so it's kind of like moms and dads have to be on the same page. They really have to be able to talk about, well, where's our daughter going to go? Where's our child going to go? Spend the night? Who are they hanging around with? And so that's so important to have wide open eyes about who they're with. You know? So, but prayer, vigilance.
Judge Kohl's story is so powerful, and he's told it all over the country many times. It never gets easier, but yet he keeps doing it. He keeps sharing the story and hoping that people will really hear what his message is. Both the message of, we've got to protect our kids with prayer and vigilance, but also that God shows up in those terrible, unthinkable things in our lives. And it's quite an encouragement.
It is. We just did an episode on the power of prayer That was episode 211. And we reminded ourselves that we don't have to live in that fear. And it was encouraging to hear Judge Kohl and how his prayer life and his intimacy with God really is what pulled him out of that darkness into a life of hope. And then right now he's using that story to redeem who knows how many people's lives.
Yeah, isn't that something? But, there was an interesting thought that went across my mind later, and I asked the judge about this fear. Like we don't want to live in fear, that's for sure. But I asked him, what do you think about using fear as a way to scare your kids about getting involved, even thinking of getting involved?
Because that's what you did
drugs.
with me.
Well, yeah, I did.
You sat me in front of that TV.
Well, I was doing those stories, and if you remember, I did that documentary on meth, and do you remember those pictures?
I do. I have nightmares about those pictures.
Yeah.
I do remember them, and I think that was good. But sorry, that's my own personal opinion.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way now, because I did use those pictures and those stories. Remember the story about the couple that sold their kids' beds to pay for their drugs. Their kids didn't have beds when we went to do the interview. It's just amazing. But he said, I think we have to use every tool in our arsenal to make it a reality to our kids, that it's not just, oh, mom and dad, you don't know what's really going on. We need to let them know, let our kids know we're informed, show them the realities of that drug world. And when those news stories come on, I used to always tell people, hey, those news stories, I don't like reporting them. They're awful, but they're a call to prayer, and they can be a tool to educate your kids.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good way to look at it. It is not trying to put fear into your children. It's giving them a picture of reality. That's the thing. You're not scaring your child and over-exaggerating the truth. You are showing them what's real, because what the other side wants to do, what the drug culture wants to do, is give them the lie. They're going to give them the scene of the fun parties and the laughing and who knows what, but they're going to paint this picture that is completely opposite of the reality. That's what we have to do as parents. We have to guide and show our kids what is real, what is true.
And that's what we were charged with. We're charged with educating, bringing our kids into the knowledge of truth. And that is one aspect of it.
It is.
Well, when we come back, you're going to hear more on how God used this tragedy in Judge Kohl's life for so much good. The story does not stop here with just, sharing with other people, as powerful as that is. But we're going to ask him more about that, and also ask how he was able to begin healing after his daughter's murder when we come back.
We're back with more of Judge Tom Kohl's tragic yet hopeful story about the brutal murder of his daughter, who was not only addicted to drugs, but deeply involved in a Russian drug gang.
We asked him, what do you do with the anger and the despair that you feel after such an unbelievable crime committed against a child? He picks up the story there.
Yeah, that's a great question. When it happened, I had so much sorrow and despair and hopelessness. I even had suicidal thoughts. I never did anything toward that, but it was like, how do you get from 1 minute to the next, from 1 hour to the next, from one day to the next, and I had I just had that despair, hopelessness. What I didn't have, which was really interesting, is I didn't have any anger or bitterness,
really,
or hatred towards the person who committed this crime. That is really, really unusual. And I think what Jesus was blessing me. He was protecting me. I didn't know it at the time. I've thought about this since then, and I thought about it right afterwards too. Is when we. I think one of the most sobering verses in the Bible is Matthew 6:14 to 16, I think it is, where Jesus is just finishing up on the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, if you forgive those who sin against you, your Father will forgive you your sins. If you don't forgive those who sin against you, then your Father will not forgive you your sins. And it's like, oh my, that's the most sobering, challenging verse in the Bible, because Jesus gave me the power to forgive the man who murdered my daughter before I even knew who his name was, and that's the only way I can explain that. It was just given to me. I didn't pray for it. He gave it to me. He knew what the story was going to be, and I think he just sort of cut that part out where I had to ask for forgiveness. He just gave it to me, you know. So about a year later, after the murder, the man who killed Megan was arrested and charged with aggravated murder. It was a murder for hire. My daughter was dealing drugs for a Russian gang in a neighboring county. And when she was arrested in May, she got the charges. They were going to be reduced to misdemeanors, so they were felony charges to be reduced to misdemeanors. As far as I can tell, the Russian gang felt that she was going to roll over on them. And so they put a contract out on her life for $1,500.
Wow.
And somebody did it. The man who did it was arrested 1 year later, as I mentioned. And then after that, a trial happened 2 years after that. I was so blessed that I was a judge in the criminal justice system. I had handled murder trials before, never expecting that I would ever be involved in the murder of any child of mine. But I knew the things that were going to happen in a murder trial, the process, the procedures, and so I was very familiar with how that was going to come down. So I was very blessed in that respect that I knew what was going to happen. So the trial occurred about 2 years later. I didn't go to the trial. I was the presiding judge in my county at the time, and I didn't want to be a distraction in the courtroom, so I stayed away. But I talked with the district attorney who was actually trying the case every night. He would give me an update on how things were going. And then eventually, after 6 weeks, the jury got to consider the case. They found the man guilty of aggravated murder. And then I had to come and testify at the sentencing phase to tell the jury how Megan's murder impacted my family and myself. And so I was able to do that. And it was a very strange feeling being in the courtroom, in the witness stand, the judge on the witness stand testifying about how that death impacted my family. And so I was able to tell the jury that, how it impacted. And then I was able to look at Robert, and that was the first time I had seen him. Although it was interesting, he had been in my courtroom about 3 years before that, and I had sentenced him on a felony charge. I have no idea how if that ever connected in any respect. But so anyway, I told Robert, I said, I had forgiven him only through the power and presence of Jesus Christ in my life. And so the jury ended up in Oregon. The jury has the power to either impose the death penalty, life without the possibility of parole, or life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. They choose one of those three, and the jury chose the middle one, life without the possibility of parole. So that's how he was sentenced. And then I started to write a book about a year later.
He did indeed write that book, and it's called Losing Megan, Finding Hope, Comfort, and Forgiveness in the Midst of Murder. His final chapter goes on to tell the story of Judge Kohl's prompting to meet with his daughter's killer in prison. And I'll tell you what, that is powerful. So if you'd like to read that book, we'll have a link for you to it so that you can get it, or maybe share it with somebody who could really use that encouragement as well.
Yeah, be sure to check out the show notes, because I know he also spoke recently in Idaho at Calvary Chapel Star. And so we'll have the link for you there if you want to hear more from his story, because there's so much that we couldn't share just, with this short time period that we got to have with him. But his story has many facets to it. And you can hear about his nonprofit as well that he started after all of all of this.
Yeah, he could write a whole book just on this nonprofit called Paid in Full that helps inmates go to seminary while they're in prison, get a 4-year college degree.
Wow.
And as soon as they get that, then they're sent out into other prisons to minister to other inmates. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, God is just, he does more than we can ever imagine, more than we could ever think of. It's just, it's such an encouraging story.
It is. I hope that you will share this podcast with somebody that you know who maybe needs that encouragement. You know, we are oftentimes thrown things our way that we never anticipated that we would have to endure, or challenges that we just don't think we can overcome, and we can't see the good that might come out of it. But God always does this. He always uses us when we allow ourselves to be used. And to see what God has done through Judge Tom Kohl's story is magnificent. And so it gives hope to me that even in the midst of my failures, or even just the things that are mucky and I did not ask for, God will transform it. God will use it for good. We hope you are encouraged. We are so thankful to KTSY for giving us this opportunity to create this community here on A Home That Heals. We love you. We are thankful for you. And so please send us messages on Facebook and Instagram if you have some encouragement for us, some tips, some ideas that we can share with our community. We love hearing from you. And we look forward to next time when we get to come together here on A Home That Heals.
A Home That Heals is produced in partnership with 89.5 KTSY. To find out more about them, go to ktsy.org.